Welcome to Healthcare De Jure, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare De Jure is sponsored by SA Ignite, the law offices of Merrick O'Connell, and the Compliancy Group. And now here is your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today are Dr. Robert Rowley and attorney David Harlow, both from Flow Health. Many of you might recognize David Harlow additionally through his Twitter handle @HealthBlog. So welcome both of you. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion about artificial intelligence and patient engagement. So I guess maybe to help set the conversation, I'd toss it out and ask you to kind of be able to give a very brief overview in terms of what you mean by artificial intelligence when we're talking about this subject matter.
Sure, let me go ahead and jump in on that one. Artificial intelligence is basically a machine learning method of identifying patterns in data. So it can be any kind of data. Artificial intelligence has been used a lot in consumer electronics. For instance, identifying patterns in your driving from your cell phone and things of that nature. In healthcare, it's about trying to look at the healthcare data that's available for the AI engine to identify patterns in, and hopefully serve up recommendations that match a particular pattern with other patterns that are seen in the database. So, for instance, if you're looking at a particular medical condition with certain medications, with certain lab values, with a certain family history, pattern matching would say, okay, given that, what do other people with that particular pattern look like, and what happened with them? How do you get to whatever outcome you're looking at? Say a diabetic with uncontrolled high blood pressure despite medications. You can come up with a pattern recognition recommendation that can be useful. So unlike prospective studies, which are the hallmark of medical research, where you have a hypothesis and you test the hypothesis, pattern recognition is looking at the state of things now and how does that compare to the broader experience. I think of it very much like how clinicians function. Clinicians do pattern recognition as part of clinical judgment. You're looking at a case, you're looking at a situation, you're taking all of the different data that's available to you into account and saying, this situation reminds me of something I saw 3 years ago or something like that, and you basically compare the pattern that you're seeing to one's own experience. With AI, you're comparing a pattern that can be identified with basically the experience of the world, or however big your database is. So it's much broader than just an individual clinician's experience. It's really the collective experience of everybody. And I believe that can be very powerful.
So is it kind of fair to kind of compare it as, as you just said, it's kind of taking that individualized physician experience and expanding it out to a much broader macro level. So it's, is it kind of comparing the physician is the micro level and then you're taking it out to the macro through AI?
I think that's fair. The macro level is as macro as the data available. So really the challenge for making this accurate and worthwhile and personalized is to try to aggregate data from as big of a data set as one could have. Obviously, if you've just got 2,000 patients as opposed to 20,000 patients as opposed to 2 million patients, it will be different as far as the accuracy and the utility of the patterns that are identified.
Right, and it seems like you probably just hit on one of the biggest issues with this idea, which would be how to get all the data, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Matt, if I could back up a minute, I mean, just to,
Sure.
I think we're assuming something, but I think it's worth just saying explicitly that the issue, the reason why we want to move in this direction, is that we don't do a very good job today, collectively, in terms of diagnosis and treatment. We are working on the basis of, as Bob said, maybe the 2,000 cases and sort of extrapolating from those, and we extrapolate from those perhaps inaccurately or insufficiently. If I remember correctly, some of the meta-analyses published in the literature say that there are diagnostic errors in maybe 10 or 15% of all cases. If not more. And we hear one way or another all the time that about a third of the healthcare spend is misspent. We're spinning our wheels, and we need to be able to get a lot more focused. Even prescription drugs that are offered to patients. Not all patients respond in the same way to a particular prescription drug. So using the tools that Bob is starting to describe is really going to be a way in which to move away from the current status quo where, we have maybe, of the top grossing drugs fail to elicit the desired effect in the vast majority of the patients for whom they are prescribed in the first instance. So we need to gather information in this way and comb through the information in this way on a very broad scale in order to, hope to achieve the outcomes of a precision medicine approach.
I think that's a very interesting observation, saying that this system as it's currently set up is inherently inefficient. Just because I think, David, as you were suggesting, there's each individual clinician is working off of a very small data set and can't necessarily maybe take advantage of that broader system that is theoretically lying out there.
Well, that's not to impugn the expertise of many clinicians who are working very well off of their internal data set. And I think, as Bob would say, you take your sort of gut instinct as an experienced clinician, and that's really what you're doing. You're doing a little combing through the data banks and saying, what does this remind me of? What does this look like? How did I treat that patient 5 years ago who came to me with this unusual combination of symptoms and lab test results?
One thing to note that's kind of interesting is there's a lot of medical knowledge that is published, the guidelines and things that are said to be the right thing to do, and a lot of times those recommendations are, those guidelines are not followed by individual clinicians. Generally for two reasons, I think. One reason is they don't know about them, because there's just such a flood of information that comes, that is published every single day. And the other is that belief that, these guidelines apply to populations of patients, but my patient is a little different. There's some nuance about the patient that I'm seeing that I know better, and again, they will substitute their gut instinct, or they'll substitute the pattern recognition against their experience to say, no, in my experience, this other method will work better. So data, recommendations, peer-reviewed findings and so forth need to be a very big part of what's recommended, but one can go from that to say, let's not use the blunt instrument of what's good for an entire population. Let's use something that's much more personalized and try to get, that's the whole idea of precision medicine. Let's try to get something that works for this specific person, given these lab tests, given, if you have DNA data, that's sort of the next frontier of health data, given your particular genetic susceptibility to certain medications and given your lab values and so forth, this is the best medication, not that medication, for the next step to get to whatever your desired outcome is. So I think that it's very exciting. I don't think it replaces what physicians do. I think that physicians can look at a recommendation and say, maybe this is the recommendation that's made for this specific patient that we have in front of us. And if they think that something else is better, that can actually teach the learning engine. They can say, well, let's see what happens if you do, instead of plan A, you have an idea that plan B is going to be better for this individual. You try plan B and you see what the outcome is going to be, and that can teach the learning engine. So it may be that it is better or it's not better. Right. And the predictive power of the AI engine is increased with usage.
Yeah, I think that's a point that you're saying, that it obviously gives the physician or the practitioner, a greater depth of information and access to information. But that description you just gave, I was almost going to ask the question. It sounds like it's, all that information almost would remove the art form and the practice to it. But I think, as you just described it, it's really just another, expanding the palette that the physician can paint with, really. Because it's always struck me that you described it as the practice of medicine, because as you said, you're trying to draw on experience and learn, and be able to evolve how you're providing care. And it's never just a static, and it's you're always learning.
Right. A couple of points on that. One is that my hope is that payers will buy into the power of the recommendations made by AI engines that are based on very large data sets, and will say, well, if this recommendation is what is recommended as the least expensive and best and fastest way to get to a specific outcome, that is what we will authorize. That sort of becomes an automated prior authorization pathway. And if a clinician wants to do something else, then he has to go through the standard authorization process of convincing peers that this alternative path is better in this case. And so I think that, if we can sort of get buy-in from payers that this can be the way of removing a lot of the prior authorization burden. As a practitioner myself, boy, would that be nice. There's a lot of time spent going through authorization hoops for formulary or for whatever. And if you had something that made a recommendation, and all of the stumbling blocks are moved out of the way by the payer as a result of kind of buying into that method, that would make life a whole lot better for a lot of practitioners and for patients, because they'll get to the definitive care right away and not be frustrated by all of the hurdles that they have typically had to jump through in the current state of things.
Right, and actually, I think that point about trying to get the payers involved presents another question in my mind, which is the current the traditional current fee-for-service system that we're still predominantly in aligned with these goals, or will it be accelerated as we continue down this what feels like an extremely fast path into alternative payments, and especially risk? Whether it be I'm up in Massachusetts, so we're pretty far. It feels like we're pretty far down the road compared to the rest of the country, or where Medicare is going, evidenced by the proposed MACRA rule that came out last week.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a tool is a tool, and how you use the tool is what determines its impact on society. I think that having AI-informed authorization pathways can work whether it's in a value-based environment or a fee-for-service environment. Having value-based or having AI tools available to power consumer-facing sort of self-care apps, sort of the next generation of self-care apps, sort of automated, digital assistants that could happen and could give patients some very useful insights without having to go to see the doctor. That's something that would be encouraged more by a value-based environment than by fee-for-service. Fee-for-service encourages providers to make sure patients come see them. And if they're paid on a different basis for population management and improved outcomes, seeing people in a burdensome in-office kind of way is not always the best way to handle situations, and the more that can be handled by sort of self-service type of consumer-facing apps, the better it would be if, in a value-based environment.
I think CMS would like to have us all internalize that kind of sensibility, so that providers, payers, and patients all are singing off the same music, where there's an emphasis on the value, and I think that's only going to continue over time, and these are the kinds of tools that need to be in the toolkit in order for that to happen successfully for all parties in this equation, providers, patients, and payers. Also, particularly as our population shifts, the so-called silver tsunami, there aren't enough younger folk out there to take care of us as we get old. So we need the rise of the machines to help out here. That's what we really need.
So do you think the tools are presently available? Are they in development? Certainly understand that, as we're talking about this transition, a lot of things are kind of in the stage one of iterations, or the version one, but are these AI tools that we're talking about available? And if there are some that are out there, do you have examples of what they are?
I think there are attempts at developing good sort of learning algorithms that the machine language, the AI tools are based upon. The key really, and the barrier really, the challenge, is the state of healthcare data, which is very fragmented. In other arenas where data is more consolidated, AI engines work much better because they're working off of larger data sets. In healthcare, it's not so much a technology barrier in not having the right apps. I think the biggest barrier is the fragmentation of health data. Right now, a lot of attention is being paid to health data has been created in silos around institutions by EHRs, and it's sort of, it's how we used to do back when everything was on paper. Everybody kept their own medical records, and you'd send copies of pertinent areas of a medical record to somebody else who needed to see it based on their request and based on patient permission. And moving all of that over to an electronic platform hasn't really changed that configuration of health data that much. So each institution, whether it be a clinical practice, a group, a hospital, or even a hospital system, each different institution keeps their own siloed data, which represents a slice of the patient's full story. And exchanging data back and forth between those silos is where a lot of attention is being paid now. But that's just making copies of the data, or making copies of an extract of the data and sending it to somebody else. It's not merging all of those different silos together. It doesn't break down the fragmentation of the data. I think more and more people who are in the health information exchange world are seeing that aggregating data rather than just doing a query response, one record at a time pass through, aggregating data is the next step that we need to get to. And I've seen various efforts at trying to build a framework that can aggregate data from multiple sources, EHRs, payer data, consumer data, survey data, device data, Internet of Things data, all that stuff merged into a single unified framework. And so various people have built that kind of framework. The company that I've co-founded builds that kind of framework, and others have built that kind of framework. Then the challenge is to get the data in there, and that's sort of where a lot of people are right now. How do you build a data set that will be there, that is sustainable? How do you create a business model around it? How do you collect that data, and then work off of the data once it's there? So I think we're kind of right on the threshold, right on the precipice of having that be a reality. But I don't think that anybody really is there yet.
And I mean, Bob, to be clear, Bob and I and others are working together to solve some of the technical problems, clinical problems, legal and regulatory problems that have grown up around the opportunities for sharing and creating a large enough large and accurate enough set of data about individual patients and then cohorts of patients in order to make this work well.
And actually, David, that's a good point. So it actually starts to go in a direction of a question I was going to follow up on, which is, almost seemed like to some degree Bob was describing, being able to collect and aggregate all of an individual's data. If I think you just started to say, that's one step, but then the next step is to get the cohort of, to start building groupings, because, I think that's really going to the promise of what you were describing, Bob, which is you have to have a wide enough, for lack of a better word, population included within that data set so you can actually start finding patterns within it.
Right. And that will be the next stage of our development. You can create a framework, but an empty framework is only interesting from an academic standpoint. It needs to be filled with lots and lots and lots of data on lots and lots of people. And I think that will be the next challenge. Not just keeping the data separate in their segregated little silos, exchanging copies with each other, which is sort of the current state of affairs if I were to oversimplify it, but actually aggregating that data together and having it be something that an AI engine can do deep machine learning off of. That to me is really exciting, and I think that's the next stage. And it's not years and years off. It's only, you can see it from here.
So when you're talking about the kind of the collection of data, what's the scope that you would hope would be included? Because one piece I was reading recently, I think it was probably talking about the IBM Watson, or one of the other big things that seems to always pop up in the news is, is it only looking at traditional healthcare information, or is it drawing in, like discussions on patient community groups, for example, where you might have a different perspective on things that, maybe not with the scientific grounding and background and not generated in the traditional healthcare setting, but arguably impactful in being able to learn from and deliver better care.
Right. I think the broader the base that the data is drawn from, the more powerful the insights that AI can deliver become. So if you're just aggregating sort of traditional healthcare data from studies, data from analyses, data from meta-analyses, data from EHRs, data from payers, that's a good start. Supplementing that with consumer data, which can come in the form of surveys, that can come from the source of consumer-facing applications or consumer-facing communities. If that gets blended in, because those are all valid observations, and pattern recognition around valid observations is where the power comes from. If it comes from sort of Internet of Things connected devices, your Fitbit, your blood pressure cuff perhaps, or a scale in your bathroom, or whatever that is connected into the internet, that kind of data can also just add more depth to the data that's there. I think we'll probably start with traditional data sources just because that's what's available. But I think once that's there and once the power becomes evident and people have the aha, this is where we need to go, you'll see a lot of entrepreneurial startup activity happen around apps that can use that and empower that.
I mean, there's already a lot going on in terms of the problem is sort of we have a bunch of silos operating. So there are a million apps that collect one kind of data and store it. And the issue is, how do we aggregate all of those things? How do we bring them together to get a holistic view of an individual, and then from there, a population, and then analyzing, how do we segment this population in different ways so that we can understand better understand more about different aspects of the population. So it could be patient-generated data, things that are entered by patient, or things that are collected passively by having the phone in your pocket all day or all week, or things through activity trackers, other kinds of things, other sorts of data. We spend, even the sickest among us spend a minority of our time in front of a healthcare professional. So the amount of data that's in the electronic health record is not that great relative to the amount of data that's available about us and our lives as a whole.
Yeah, and actually that probably offers a nice transition into tying it into patient engagement, which is, in this kind of realm, what is meant by patient engagement? Because I think this one of those amorphous phrases where to some degree it means something different to anybody who's thinking of it. And then also, what's the ideal way for the patient to be able to assist in allowing this aggregation and freeing up of data?
Just to start off, the health reform law, among its many wonderful things, was wonderful in that it's the first time that Congress used patient-centeredness, patient-centered, patient-focused language in the statute. They weren't able to define it clearly, but it's a first step. So putting the patient at the center is a first step. There's been much ink spilled over trying to define what is patient-centered. How do we achieve patient engagement, both from the provider and payer communities, and also, I think, most importantly, from the patient communities. And payers and providers need to listen carefully to patients when we think about how do we engage patients. Because if we only talk to each other without reaching out, then we're not going to be able to do that effectively.
Right. I would add to that by saying patient engagement is not, to many providers, it's how do I get patients to listen to what I tell them? That's not what patient engagement is. The patient-centeredness is how do you empower people to and give them the tools to take care of their own health, those who are motivated to take care of their own health, and do so and facilitate that. And how do you create a healthcare payment environment that facilitates that too, so that better outcomes are in everybody's interest? I think patient empowerment is very important. I think that the tools are really embryonic right now to help people take care of their health. They're generally working off of data sets that are segregated away from the data that their doctors are looking at. That all needs to be collected. When you have aggregated data, it's around the patient at the center. That's how you pull all that information together. You need to resolve unique patients and unique providers so that it's all tied together. Not everybody sees all the data. Each different participant, each different stakeholder might see a different subset of the data depending on what their needs are. But when you have the patient at the center from a data structure standpoint, you can also have patients at the center of the permissions giving standpoint, so that an individual can say, I want you to see this data, I want this other person to see this other subset of my data, and I want to be able to see all of it. I think that's patient-centeredness in its broader context.
And I like how you just reframed it, which is instead of saying patient engagement, it's really patient-centeredness, and it's representing. I think as this whole conversation has shown a shifting of thinking about how healthcare is going. But believe it or not, we are out of time already. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Rowley and David, for our great conversation today.
Thank you. There's so much more to say. Half hour.
That's right. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, well, and thank you to everyone out there for listening. We can certainly keep the dialogue going. Connect with me at #HCDeJure, so HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.